Right.
Better than your last one.
Well, that's fair, you know. That's fair. Heather Dion, right?
Yes.
With CASA, court-appointed special advocates. They intervene and advocate for children in at-risk situations. She is the executive director. Heather, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks everyone, thanks for having me today. Like Chris said, I'm Heather Dion. I'm the executive director of CASA of Central Oregon. We are a nonprofit organization that advocates for children in foster care. And so what that looks like, I know several of you, I think I presented to you about a year ago at this time. Some of you have heard it. I mean, Ron, you've heard me a few times by this point, but I appreciate you having me back. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what we do. And so, like I said, we train, we recruit, train, and support volunteers to be court-appointed special advocates. And so what that is that they advocate for children in foster care. Our organization, we serve Crook, Deschutes, and Jefferson counties. And so if you look here, we're right here in the middle of the state. We are one of 20 programs here in the state of Oregon that advocates for kids in foster care. The CASA program was started, and can you hear me in the back? I want to make sure I'm thank you. A little more? Okay, I'll try to project, but just remind me if I'm getting quiet. The CASA program was started in the 1970s by a judge up in the Seattle area. And the things that makes CASA volunteers unique is that court part of court-appointed special advocates. And that is where we advocate for children in court. And if you're not very familiar with the foster care system, you might be thinking, well, why are kids in foster care in court? And so the way that that works is that when a child is found to be in an imminent threat of harm, that is that they are in danger. Some of you may have had experiences where you've had to call like the child abuse hotline, or you're familiar with that. The State of Oregon Department of Human Services will go and investigate. And they'll make the determination to remove a child. They'll say this child's in imminent threat of harm. There is danger in this child's home. This child is going to be hurt if they stay here. And then they go in front of a judge and they say, Judge, please grant the state of Oregon or the state custody of this child. Take custody away from their parents and make the state the custodian. And the judge said, yep, that's the exact thing that we should do. Well, after that point is made, all the decisions about that child's life are made by that judge. And the judge will likely never meet the child. So the day-to-day decisions about the child are made by the Department of Human Services, and the major decisions about whether to return a child back to their parents or not are made by a judge. So in the 1970s, there was a judge up in Seattle, a judge named David Sukup, and he was going to make a determination. He was going to, so the story goes, to terminate a parent's rights, forever separating the child from their parents. And he's looking around the courtroom, and he sees the parents, and he sees their attorneys, and he sees the state of Washington, and he sees all these people. And you realize he's going to make a decision about the affects this child forever, this child who has already experienced abuse and neglect. And he is going to forever separate them from their parents. And he doesn't know how the child feels about it. He doesn't know if it's in the child's best interest. He knows what all the adults are telling him. He doesn't know what's going on for that child. And so that's how the CASA program is born. So when these volunteers are making these when these judges are making these determinations about children, they have a volunteer, they have a community member, just average community member, whose sole purpose is to advise the judge about the best interest of the child. So when judges here in Central Oregon are making decisions about children in foster care, we want to make it our job that they always have a CASA there who's advocating for that child's best interests. And then the CASA role goes much more beyond that. So we're advocating for children in court. We're also advocating for children in foster care in their schools. We're advocating for them within the child welfare system. We are their advocates. We are their voice to make sure that in all of these systems that are focused on their parents and they're focused on the adults in their life, that child's unique needs are not lost during their time in foster care. And so what does that look like here in Central Oregon? So what it looks like is right now there's almost 300 children who are in foster care. That's in Crook, Deschutes, and Jefferson counties. Our organization is pretty good, and we're able to serve with our volunteers 237 of these children so that they have a CASA volunteer. However, that means that 56 children are right now waiting for a volunteer. So they're in foster care, but they don't have that advocate to get to know them and make sure that their voice is heard. In order to serve these children, we would need about 50 additional CASA volunteers. If you're thinking to yourself, why aren't we serving those kids? It's because we don't have enough volunteers. So what does that look like right here in Redmond? Of those kids, about 53 kids from the Redmond area are currently in foster care. We're able to serve the majority of them with a volunteer, but right now 9 are waiting for a volunteer. So these are children who have experienced profound trauma, and they are in foster care. If we were to serve them, we would need 8 additional volunteers. So when I talk about profound trauma, people are like, okay, what does that mean? What that looks like is that means these children who they've experienced physical abuse, they've experienced neglect, they've experienced sexual abuse, they've experienced medical neglect, and oftentimes they're coming into foster care. They're often behind, and they have unmet needs. They have unmet physical needs, they have unmet medical needs, dental needs. They often need assistance in schools. The reason they've experienced this is because their parents generally either have some pretty significant substance abuse disorder that's making it so that they can't parent, or mental health issues making it so that they can't parent their children. So their children are just the most innocent victims. And I often say that being in foster care for a child, like these children in Redmond and all of Central Oregon, is like being between a rock and a hard place. So the children are no longer in that unsafe situation. They're no longer experiencing the kind of abuse and neglect that they had at home. But foster care is a really hard place for a child to grow up. What that looks like here in Central Oregon is that when a child is in foster care, they will have an average of 4 different caseworkers. That means that caseworker who's making those day-to-day decisions about that child, that is changing on a very regular basis. They'll live in an average of 3 different foster homes. So that child is moving to multiple homes during their time in care. And they're in foster care for an average of 2 years. So the child is safe, but that's a lot of turmoil, continued turmoil that these children are experiencing. We want to make it our job at CASA that they have one person, one CASA volunteer, who's the consistent person in their life during their time in foster care. Because we can't fix the hard place, or we can't fix the rock, but we can do what we can to make their hard place a little bit easier for them, and we can make sure that they're not there by themselves, which is pretty impactful. So I'd like to show a video of a story that we just made recently about, I could talk about like, oh, CASAs are so important, or I could let this video speak for itself. So this is about a young lady named Miss Evie. We had the opportunity to meet and make a video of her CASA Larry.
The first year of Evie's life, she was removed from her birth parents at 4 weeks old and placed in foster care.
We became foster parents in May of 2017 when we got our first placement, and then we got Evie in July of 2017.
The first time I met Evie was at the foster family's home, and Evie was just 8 weeks old.
When we got her, it was almost like she was just kind of deer in the headlights, to be honest, for probably the first month. And then one morning we went and woke her up, and my husband picked her up, and it was just like the light had come on, and it was just, she was chock full of personality. It was just like, okay, I know I'm safe, here I am, and her whole personality came out.
The court-appointed special advocates are trained volunteers that are appointed by a juvenile court judge to give voice and speak to the needs of a child who was brought before the court for reasons of neglect or abuse.
I knew what a CASA was, vaguely, and what they were supposed to be. But it was, he introduced himself, he was in court from the very beginning. And so he's essentially known Evie as long as we have. Every court hearing we ever had with Larry, he would always talk to us ahead of time and let us know and get updated information about what's going on, how are things going, and ask specific questions about Evie and what's going on in her world. And then he would give reports to the judge. When we went to the other county for court hearings, there was no voice for that little girl. Without anybody in there talking to the judge and saying, this is what is in the best interest of this child, it was very frustrating. And I felt like that baby didn't get as much representation and advocacy as Evie did, having Larry as her CASA.
At the 10-month point, she was reunited with one of her parents, and the case was closed. 3 months after her case being closed, I got a call from the Bend Police Department. The officer described to me in some level of detail what was going on, and my heart broke. I knew at that moment that I had failed Evie, and I vowed to do whatever it took to make it right.
We were maintaining our relationship virtually with Evie at the time during those 3 months, and then we got a phone call saying, would you be willing to take Evie back into your home as a resource parent, because some things have occurred and we need to place her, even though you live several counties away now. And of course we said, absolutely, we're on our way.
About a year into the second placement, I started advocating for adoption, and the DHS plan of record was still return to parent. I felt strongly, and the child's attorney felt strongly, and so we stood our ground, and eventually we all came to the same place. When I found out the adoption was finalized, I was thrilled. I could envision Evie's wonderful, happy life going forward. She may have been dealt a bad hand at birth, but I felt she hit the jackpot with her adopted family. This is from the final CASA report prior to adoption. Evie has been in the loving care of the foster parents for 47 of her 50 months of life. She is completely bonded, attached, and knows them as her parents. In all respects, Evie is healthy, happy, and functioning well in the care of the foster family. She has recovered well from her early traumatic experiences. CASA has been advocating for Evie's adoption by the foster family consistently for 20 months. CASA strongly recommends and supports the decisions of both biological parents to relinquish their parental rights and their desire for the foster family to adopt Evie.
Evie is a rambunctious, very, very intelligent, almost 6-year-old now. She is incredibly artistic, which I understand comes from her biological mom, and she loves art. The main reason I think CASAs are important is that they're the one person that shows up in that courtroom that isn't distracted by anything else other than what's in the best interest of the child. From the minute we met her, we knew that she was special, and she shows us every single day that she is.
So that's a specific example of the way that Larry helped this one little Miss Evie, who's a little sassafras. It was fun to be at the park with her that day. National studies have shown that when a child has a CASA, there's some pretty specific tangible good that it does. So a child with a CASA is more likely to move into a safe and permanent home more quickly. When they move into that home, they're more likely to stay in that home. They're less likely to come back into foster care. A child with a CASA does better in school. They're more likely to receive the services that they need to be successful in school, and they're less likely to be expelled. And then they're more likely to receive the support that they need to heal and thrive, like I talked about, that the dental services, the physical health services, the doctor's appointment, occupational therapy, mental health services. Oftentimes these kiddos come in and they have some pretty significant needs, and a child with a CASA is more likely to have those needs met. So what I'm looking for from you all is we are looking for more volunteers. So like I said, community volunteers can come from all walks of life. They just need to be 21 years or older, be willing to pass a background check, and complete 40 hours of training. And then we ask that our volunteers, it's about 10 to 15 hours of commitment a month. And then we ask that they stay on for the life of the case, which is an average of 2 years. We have volunteers who are in their 20s. We have volunteers who are professionals. We have a lot of volunteers who are retired. And essentially what we often say is a CASA is an ordinary person who does extraordinary things for a child in foster care. Like I said, we've got kids right now who don't have CASAs, and I believe every child needs an advocate. And so that's what I'm doing, is asking you all if you are interested in becoming a volunteer, or if you know of somebody who has been saying, I'd like to do a little more, or I might be interested in a volunteer thing, send them my way. I've got some brochures, and I'd love to talk to people about becoming CASA volunteers. So right now we've got about 150 volunteers, which is great. But if we were to serve all children in Central Oregon, we would need closer to 200, which is, it's a big ask, but it's doable within our community. So I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all have. Yes?
For those children that are old enough to understand what's happening, psychologically, are there issues with them? And if there are there resources that can help them?
Yeah, so all children who experience trauma, whether or not they can understand it or not, yes, it absolutely leaves a mark. And there are mental health services that can help children in behavioral health services. And what it is depends on the age of the child. If it's like play therapy for a little one or more talk therapy for an older one. Equine therapy, horse therapy, working with horses can have incredible impact for children. So absolutely, they do experience issues with it or, lasting effects, but there are services to help them.
Why the imbalance right now? Who refers between the courts?
As far as
Foster
referring kids to us or referring volunteers?
Right, kids.
Well, so our program, we are assigned to all children currently in foster care. So our program is assigned, and then when we have a volunteer available, we assign a volunteer. And it's a fact of a lack of volunteers. Over the state of Oregon, about 50% of kids have a CASA. So we're well above state average, but it's the kids that don't have a CASA that keep me up at night.
Okay. And what's the primary impediment to getting more CASA volunteers? Training?
I think it's a time factor. I think some people are, they don't necessarily have the time. I know from a lot of folks who say, when I retire, I'll do this. I think it's not the right volunteer role for everybody, I'll be honest. It can be a challenging volunteer role. There's some frustration dealing within the child welfare system. But I think that when it's the right role for somebody, it can be really impactful.
The other thing was there was almost a presumption that being pushed to return a child to the family of origin was a bad thing.
Yeah.
There are state laws and requirements.
There is,
Are you
yeah.
really prejudiced that way?
Yeah, well, it's, that's interesting feedback. I'll think about that. So, yeah, the emphasis is within at least the first year is to try to return a child back to their parents. Because as hard as it is to understand, even being removed from, an abusive situation, children love their parents. And so the best possible situation is if parents can essentially become healthy and become stable and be able to parent their children. That's the best possible scenario. And so the idea is to try to put those supports in place so that the child can do that. And so that's what happened with this case is there was the genuine belief, and Larry had it as well, that Evie would be safe with one of her parents. And then it was a big disappointment to everyone when that was not the case.
Well, how do you document something's changed? Does the police have to call
Yeah. Well, the child comes back into care. So yeah, sometimes it's because the police are called. Sometimes it's because the parents are arrested. Sometimes it's anyone who's been a teacher or a mandated reporter has probably made calls to the child abuse hotline. Sometimes it's some of those phone calls. Yeah.
talking to schools and teachers?
Talking to schools and the teachers. Yeah.
How does a child as young as Evie wind up in the foster care program at such an early age?
Yeah. I can't speak specifically for Evie's case, but often it can sometimes be issues, things are identified at the child's birth. So St. Charles might call. Sometimes it's issues the pediatrician might call, neighbors, parents being arrested. There's a lot of reasons why the little ones will come in.
So does the CASA put the community partners together, or does the court give you a list of community partners that can help?
Yeah,
you mentioned.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Mental health or behavioral health.
Yeah. So this ODHS, the caseworker, is responsible for connecting those community partners. However, like I talked about with that caseworker turnover, or oftentimes our caseworkers are carrying really high caseloads, and so the CASA, we don't want them to be the resource, but we want them to connect them to the resource. So what that looks like is sometimes going, we think this child needs some counseling. Hey, caseworker, let's get a referral for some counseling services. Oh, do we need to sign an extra form? Or maybe they know that the child needs to, might need glasses or some dental services. And then maybe the CASA is, just kind of, hey, touch and base, let me follow up. Or, hey, foster parent, do you need a recommendation for some local dentists? can I help you look that up? So the CASA isn't necessarily responsible for getting those services, but what we, one of our volunteers says that the CASA's job is to be consistent and persistent. And so just being that consistent voice, like, hey, what about this? Oh, hey, can I help, can I make some phone calls for you? Or, oh, do you need a list of this? Or, oh, you need some sports equipment. Let me call some local nonprofits that donate sports equipment. Just kind of that consistent and persistent person to just kind of show up, make some touches, kind of maybe push a little bit, make some reminders. Yeah.
Are you talking about Jill?
Are you talking about Jill?
Hey, some of you know my friend Linda is raising her grandchildren. And CASA is fantastic.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Pardon?
I'm glad to hear that.
Jill is our contact, and she is wonderful. She has helped Linda find all kinds of avenues. Sky's 8, going on 25. No, she'll be 9 in November. Nico just became an adult. But we find out, she's 18, we find out through Jill that there's programs in DHS, that there's programs even after she's 18.
Yes.
As long as she sticks with it. He sticks with it, sorry. So I think CASA is, since it's a volunteer, they kind of want to be there. They're an advocate for the court system, because you got to remember, you have the parent on one side, DHS on the other side. CASA is kind of the neutral player. What is in the best interest of the child. And it's amazing how it works. I'm in awe. And a lot of it, Jill is just fantastic. Sky, who's a little behind when Linda got her, she's now up at a grade level. Thanks a lot of that to Linda. But Jill also told her what programs are available through the schools. So we get Sky signed up, IEP, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And so just the amount of information you can get from the CASA person is amazing. And Jill does a fantastic job.
Oh,
it's great, and just to see the changes in the kids. One, they got a stable life now, but also between Jill and the therapies and all that stuff, which sometimes is nonstop with 2. It's amazing how the kids have grown. I mean, Nico has a job now, and so it's great. But I was glad to see her on the program today because I'm a fan of CASA.
Yeah, so that's, just to use that as an example from Linda. So my guess is her hands are pretty busy with taking care of these kids. So the CASA is a support and an assistance and to try to find those services and just help out anyway. And these kids, they come in and they're great kids and they're sweet and they're goofy and they need a lot. So the more adults on their life is the better. Yeah.
You mentioned that kids can be placed back, if I heard you correctly, back in their home if there's a change in the adults and whatever the problems are. How is that facilitated?
Yeah, so like for an example, if you have a parent who maybe is not safe because they have a really significant substance abuse disorder, their addiction, if they are showing that over a period of time, there's a set number of things that they need to do to show that they're safely addressing that addiction. And if they're showing that that's happening, and if they're consistently, showing up for, the home visits with their child and time with their child, if they're showing up for that, and every time they're showing up and they're looking a little better and they're talking a little better, and they're, and ODHS is getting in touch with their treatment program, and they're saying, yep, they're showing up to every meeting, they're at every group, and over a period of time, then they might sort of do what's called an in-home plan, where they'll put the child back in their home, but continue monitoring for a while until ODHS closes the case and steps out of it. So it's typically a little bit of a slow, careful process. And most cases, so most of the time, more than 60% of children are returned back to their parents, which is wonderful. I mean, that's what we want, is we want a family that is breaking down and struggling to be able to heal and get whole again, and the child's able to go back to their parents. And And then if that can't happen, then what happens a little less likely is either guardianship or adoption. Or sometimes what happens, we call an aging out process, which is when children turn 18 or 21. And that's, I know that's an issue that's near and dear to your heart, Ron. That's a really vulnerable time for kids, particularly kids who have been in foster care. And so having the CASA during that time is really important to kind of help them navigate that going from, you know, it's a vulnerable time for any of us, but particularly if your child has been in foster care.
Thank you.
I assume there's a problem in recruiting foster parents too.
There is also a big challenge in recruiting foster
Kind of the leading
parents.
edge here, I think.
It is, yeah. The best case scenario for a child is if they can go with a family member, so like a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, family friend, somebody the child knows. Because that's, you know, if you imagine, you know, those of you who have children, if you were to, you know, you pick up Chris's children and bring them to my house, that would still be traumatic for them, or vice versa. If my children would go to your house, that would still be traumatic. So it's obviously the best case scenario is if they can go to somebody who they know already. If that's not available, then they'll go to a non-relative foster parent, and we don't have enough foster parents in Central Oregon. I'm just going to be clear about that. We don't have enough CASAs, we don't have enough foster parents. So if anybody's interested in wanting to become a foster parent, talk to me. I'll connect you to the right people because we need you.
The foster parents, if I understand correctly, will actually get compensation to take a child
There is a
into their
small amount of
house.
compensation as a foster
Yeah.
parent, yes. Yeah.
And obviously, it's more full-time.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you have a child in your home. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There is some compensation related to that. Yes. I think there was another question that I might have missed.
How often is it not,
Does it not work?
where they have to do what occurred here with that?
Yeah. Once a child, I don't have exact numbers on that. I would say once a child goes back home, I would say between 10 and 20% of the time. So most of the time it works. I'll say that. Most of the time a child goes home and it works. And when it doesn't, it's heartbreaking.
The younger the child, the better, maybe?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Depends. Every family, I mean, every family's different, even families in foster care. Yeah. Yep, depends.
Heather, thank you so
All
much.
right, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Oh,
One of our
that's really sweet.
Kiwanis pens.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, here.
Oh, sorry.
I'm gonna grab a picture.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hang out a little.
I thought she.
Spaced out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and dismiss us. Remember, service hours and tip your server. Thank you.